Hello and welcome to yet another edition of COVID-19. I'm Min San-hee. Here on the local front, concerns are mounting over cluster infections at places of worship at the metropolitan area and more recently an education center in the southern port city of Busan. Also around the world, there is talk of herd immunity following the results of a survey in India. We'll bring you details later on. Here first are the latest numbers on the pandemic with our Kwon So-ah and related news with our Kim Mo-gyan. So I hear on this Wednesday we have more than 50 cases.
Yes, Sunny, and that's happened for the first time this month and is largely attributed to cluster infections in the metropolitan region and also including outbreaks at small churches that spread to other vulnerable locations such as large-scale markets.
Right, and I hear officials are having difficulties pinpointing the origin of these cluster infections, like those linked to a ship in Busan.
Exactly. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, we had a rise in cases linked to a Russia-flagged ship, and that's been added to the domestic tally because this ship is traveling in Korean waters. But during epidemiological studies, we learned that one of the patients seemed to have had contact with someone from abroad who was not properly abiding by self-isolation measures. So the source could actually be from abroad. While the official tally today shows us that we have more cases that are local infections, in fact 35 local infections and 19 imported cases, which means 54 is the tally we're seeing here today on Wednesday. And the death toll remains at 305. We have 623 people remaining in quarantine and 13,786 people have made a full recovery with 57 new recoveries. And let's go over to our graph now. Daily cases surged to the 50s some 20 days ago. So then we had 58 cases. And in the past 8 days, we had cases between the 20s and 40s in overall. But unfortunately, now we have a surge by 20 this Wednesday. Now let's move over to our map. Local infections were at the highest in 20 days. I just want to make a quick correction. Daily cases surged to the 50s for the first time in 17 days. And for the first time in 20 days, we are seeing the highest figure when it comes to domestic infections. In fact, we have 19 cases in Gyeonggi-do province, which are all local infections. And out of 15 in Seoul, 13 are local infections. And we also have here 4 cases in Busan, but this number is expected to go up tomorrow because we have a report of a group infection at an education facility in Busan. Now, this is why health authorities have asked for extra vigilance in the metropolitan region as well as in Busan and asked for people to abide by measures, especially if they're using multi-use facilities. Now, speaking of facilities, the government in its earlier announcement at its briefing this morning said stronger measures at funerals and weddings will be implemented ahead of an expected increase in the use of related facilities in autumn. Now, at funeral venues, managing staff must wear face masks and deny entry to visitors without masks. Authorities also recommend QR code registration at entrances and also similar at wedding venues, along with QR code logs. Stronger measures regarding wedding halls that have buffets are to be implemented. While buffets were designated as high-risk facilities back in June, there were calls on separate measures at buffets within wedding venues, including wearing face masks, of course, again, while getting food. Now, authorities also encourage giving tokens of appreciation as an alternative to dining at the venue.
I see. Meanwhile, on the international front, Russia has registered a vaccine for the coronavirus.
Right. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced on Tuesday that his country has indeed become the first country to register a vaccine against COVID-19. Now, that would follow less than 2 months of clinical trials, while phase 3 is yet to begin on Wednesday. Putin, however, says all necessary conditions have been met and even claims one of his daughters has taken it, saying, quote, "In this sense, she took part in the experiment." The vaccine, named Sputnik 5, is facing skepticism from the World Health Organization as well as other countries due to a lack of research on long-term effects, while Moscow plans on a mass vaccination around October.
Well, we are in desperate need of a vaccine, but safety must be the priority. All right, so to give us an update on the latest global figures then.
All right, let's start with the U.S., which is actually one of the countries who has been criticizing Russia for accusing Russia for actually stealing information on COVID-19 research. Well, if you take a look at the U.S.'s figure, 5.3 million, but we're actually seeing a decline in daily figures, which are now below 50,000, and also some 50,000 new cases in Brazil, now at 3.1 million. Concern here in India, 2.3 million, which now has more than 60,000 cases on a daily basis. And Mexico over here is approaching 500,000 cases when it comes to the total tally. And Russia actually is also seeing a decline here with less than 5,000 new cases. Let's move over to other parts of the world. One concern here in Colombia, which has been seeing 10,000 new cases on a daily basis, but this time we're even seeing 12,000 new cases. And here over in Spain, which seemed to have contained the virus weeks ago, now is seeing a resurgence in cases. And according to a separate AFP tally, its daily average is more than the combined average of the UK, France, Germany, and Italy. Now, all of these 12 countries combined, meanwhile, account for 14.7 million cases. And with the rest of the world, they have more than 20.5 million cases, with some 272,000 new cases added in the span of 24 hours. The death toll stands at almost 746,000, and recoveries are at 13.4 million. And those are the updates I have for now. Stay safe, everyone, and back to you, Sunny.
All right, so thank you for that. We have no afternoon briefing today, so I'll see you tomorrow. Right, torrential rain has battered the peninsula in recent weeks, taking dozens of lives and forcing thousands out of their homes. This unfortunate reality is also raising concerns of possible outbreaks at temporary shelters that have been set up for those displaced. For more on this, I have our Kim Mo-gyeon here in the studio. Welcome, Mo-gyeon. Good afternoon. Mo-gyeon, let's start with an update of the current situation then.
Sure. As of Wednesday morning, the flood has killed at least 33 people and 9 are still unaccounted for. And since August 1st, more than 76,000 people across the country have been forced to leave their residence and stay in temporary shelters as their homes have been severely damaged due to flooding and landslides. Though some have returned home, nearly half of the evacuees still remain in emergency shelters. This may not be over just yet, with the National Weather Agency forecasting Seoul, Gyeonggi-do Province and parts of Gangwon-do Province to see more rain until August 16th.
Which is why there is much concern of the possibility of an outbreak at these temporary shelters. Mo-gyeon, do tell us about the situation there.
Well, many evacuees have been staying at state-designated community centers and gymnasiums. The government has been providing them with separate resting areas for each household. But since there are many people at these shelters, they're experiencing difficulties in maintaining social distance. So, for instance, if we take a look at the temporary shelter in Anseong City in Gyeonggi-do Province, nearly 100 people are staying there due to landslides in the area. And people are staying in designated tents set up 1 meter apart and are being asked to use a public bathroom to take showers. During the morning hours, they head out to assist relief efforts. Then they return to the shelter for dinner before going to bed. Since they have to live in tight clusters, health authorities called on facility managers to take strict preventative measures.
It's important to observe disease prevention measures at temporary shelters to prevent the spread of COVID-19. I asked the managers of the shelters to hold regular temperature checks and disinfect objects that people touch frequently.
The Center for Disease Control and Prevention also laid down some guidelines for the flood victims. They include wearing masks, drinking and cooking with boiled or bottled water, and frequently washing their hands. But since people staying in the facilities have lost their homes and are still in emotional distress, it appears that these guidelines are the least of their worries at the moment.
Honestly, I'm more concerned about the flooding than COVID-19 because that's what I'm dealing with right now.
Most people here have forgotten about the outbreak. Some are not wearing face masks. The problem is that we have all ages here, including those in their 40s to 70s.
I see. What has the government done, Mogyeon, to mitigate the flood damage and, of course, to prevent the possible spread of COVID-19 at these temporary shelters?
Well, last Friday, President Moon Jae-in actually designated 7 worst-hit regions as special disaster zones, allowing for the use of emergency relief funds for the areas. These areas include the city of Ansong in Gyeonggi-do Province, Cheolwon in Gangwon-do Province, and parts of the Chungcheongbuk-do and Chungcheongnam-do provinces, with more to follow. If a region is designated as a special disaster zone, the local authorities can get 50 to 80% of the funds they need for recovery from the central government. Also, residents who've suffered property damage or lost their livelihoods are eligible for disaster relief funds and don't have to pay for their utility bills. Meanwhile, rival political parties have been actively participating in volunteer activities to help regions hit hard by the heavy rainfall. And in a rare message of unity, lawmakers stressed the need to pass a 4th supplementary budget for this year, claiming the flood damage is too severe. But in a joint meeting just this morning, officials from the Blue House, the government, and the ruling party decided to postpone the decision as current expenses can be financed with funds that still remain. In the meantime, the 3 sides vowed to provide additional financial aid to the victims and do their best to support the relief efforts.
The government has decided to double the amount of natural disaster relief in the case of death and double the amount of flood support aid.
Right, and that is the situation here in South Korea. What is the situation like up north across the border?
Well, North Korea is also experiencing difficulties. North Korea has seen damage in many parts of the regions, including the border area of Kaesong and the southern rice-producing regions. On Monday, the North state media reported that the North received as much as 200 millimeters of rain in Hwanghae and Gangwon provinces, adding that workers and farmers are working to protect farmland and crops from heavy downpours and strong winds. The regime has been on high alert in recent weeks to minimize the impact of the floods on its agricultural sector amid concerns that poor harvests could aggravate its chronic food shortage.
Right, Mogyeon. Hopefully there'll be no further damage. Thank you very much for that report. Hope to see you back again.
Thank you.
Right, in other news, indoor fitness facilities have opened doors following some 2 months of closure. And given the potential risk of COVID-19 within confined and crowded spaces, health experts are sharing tips on how to ensure a safe workout at these centers. Do take a look.
This is a private fitness center in Seoul's Gyeonggi district. Let's see what changes have taken place here amid COVID-19.
저희 센터에서 하는 것들은 좀 정부 지침을 좀 따라서 지금 매일 소독과 기구 닦는 것들, 발열 체크 그런 것들을 매일매일 하고 있습니다.
Gym users must also exercise rigorous hygiene measures, such as using hand sanitizers before entering the facility. After a bit of stretching and warming up, it's time to break a few sweats. So what precautions do people need to take while working out?
운동은 가급적 실외에서 혼자 하는 것이 좋겠지만 실내 헬스 시설을 이용하는 경우에는 반드시 마스크 착용을 시행해야 되고 특히 여러 사람이 이용하는 만큼 손 씻기나 손 소독을 자주 하는 것이 좋습니다. 또한 땀을 흘리는 경우에는 개인 수건을 이용하시는 것이 좋습니다.
Wearing a mask can be discomforting when you're working out, especially if you're sweating and breathing heavily. What should you do in this case?
마스크 필터는 습기에 약하기 때문에 땀을 많이 흘리거나 숨을 몰아쉬게 되면 마스크의 필터 기능이 손상될 수 있습니다. 따라서 땀을 많이 흘린 경우는 30분에서 1시간 정도에 한 번씩 갈아주어야 되고 땀을 별로 흘리지 않는 무산소 운동 등을 하는 경우에는 운동하는 내내 마스크 착용을 하시는 것이 좋습니다.
Therefore, if you plan on exercising for more than 30 minutes, make sure you have a spare mask. Above all, it is better not to exercise too strenuously when you're wearing a mask.
마스크를 장시간 착용하게 되면 산소 포화도가 떨어지기 쉽고 호흡이 가빠질 수 있는데 심박동수도 10회 이상 올리는 경우가 있기 때문에 고강도의 운동보다는 평소보다 저강도로 운동하는 것이 좋고 유산소 운동이나 무산소 운동의 강도를 낮추어서 지속적으로 하는 것이 좋습니다.
In the case of swimming pools, how can we implement disease prevention measures when masks cannot be worn in the water.
마스크 착용과 또 비접촉 발열 체크를 하고 그리고 기존 회원들은 키오스크 시스템을 해서 입장서부터 퇴장시까지의 모든 관리가 되고 일일 입장객들은 QR코드로 또 수기로서 확인을 하고 있습니다. 실내에서 소독을 하루 3번 정도를 하고 있고 수영용품인 회원들이 사용하는 킥보드나 아쿠아봉 등 저희가 수시로 지도자들이 소독을 하고 있습니다.
So what do swimming pool users think about these measures?
걱정이 좀 되니까 수영 끝나고는 되도록이면 빨리 마스크를 쓰고 하도록 노력하고 있습니다.
Experts say COVID-19 is not a waterborne disease, and that chlorine used to disinfect the water is known to weaken the virus. But it is still too early to let our guards down.
저희는 물속에서도 가급적 신체 접촉이나 대화하는 것을 강습 중에 항상 자제를 시키고 있습니다.
Frequent physical contact and conversations increase the risk of nasal infection, so be sure to remain alert. So how can you keep yourself safe from COVID-19 once you're out of the water?
탈의실이라든지 샤워실과 같이 여러 명이 이용하는 공간에서는 가급적 거리 두기를 하고 오래 머물지 않는 것이 좋습니다. 이 물 밖에 있는 경우는 똑같이 위험에 노출이 되기 때문에 마스크를 착용할 수 있을 때에는 항상 착용을 하는 것이 좋습니다.
Proper disease prevention measures are a must at swimming pools, whether you're in or out of the water.
Over in India, new findings show 57% of people in Mumbai slums have coronavirus antibodies. For more on this reality, I have Professor Ullas Kultur from Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. Welcome, Professor Kultur.
Hi.
Professor, I understand that a serological survey, which is a kind of blood test, was conducted in July on almost 7,000 people across 3 suburbs in India's financial center of Mumbai. Professor, please do tell us more about the findings, and do these findings mean that India may be heading towards herd immunity?
I think we'll take the herd immunity question a little later because I think that's a complex answer. Now, I think it's a given that serological tests are important to ascertain or know how much of the population is infected in the past. One of the key things that we want to do in this particular study is to ask whether population density is a bigger determinant of infection, because although this is true for Mumbai, but it could be relevant for any other megacity anywhere in the world where you have low density and high density population. So given this, we designed a study to capture percentage of people who are exposed. And what is surprising is that we found that while in the slums we had 57% people who were exposed, people in the non-slums, which are in the high rises, there were only 16% population that was affected. That was a very big finding.
So, Professor, how do you explain the wide presence of coronavirus antibodies in the poverty-stricken areas as compared to the non-slums, like you just said?
Yeah, so one of the possibilities are many. One of the things that we think has contributed to this widespread is intermingling and crowding, right? So shared facilities and people living in close quarters where they can't afford social distancing might be one of the main contributors. Whereas in the more affluent parts of the city, people are able to maintain better social distancing measures or physical distancing. That seems to have been the key for this difference.
I see. Professor, initially countries like Sweden and the UK had bet on herd immunity to fight COVID-19, but results there have been less favorable when compared to India, which had not even considered such a strategy. Do you suppose factors like age, race, and perhaps environment are very important in building herd immunity, in building antibodies, that is?
Absolutely. So it's quite possible that the demography plays a big role. I mean, if you look at the average population and their age, I think India still has a large population which is slightly younger. That's one possibility. You're right that it could also be something to do with the race and the other infections that the population is exposed to. It's in fact, I think based on our study, people would want to now go back and ask what other factors would be important in determining herd immunity.
Professor, what is the threshold for reaching herd immunity against COVID-19, and are there any other prerequisites for such an immunity to prevail, do you think?
Yeah, so one of the key things, I mean, of course, there are several attempts to understand at what percentage of infection herd immunity is reached, and people believe it could be between 60 to 7%. But a key aspect that people forget is we don't know how long the immunity lasts. So, of course, there are studies which are still emerging to indicate that we could be protected for, I mean, at least the antibody titers might be there for between 2 to 3 months. And there is also this T-cell immunity where you may not be able to detect enough antibodies. So these are still early days, and it's important to wait. But at least based on our study, we think if herd immunity is reached, slums would reach herd immunity sooner than later.
I see. Could we go back to my first question now then, Professor? Is India heading towards herd immunity then, given what you've said so far?
Yeah, in pockets, if the immunity persists, it's quite likely that we might see herd immunity. Of course, I think our data now provides more information for epidemiologists to model this, because you need to also take into account the disease transmission, where you're now looking at daily reported cases and the number of deaths. So the trend looks promising, but I think it's still too early to make a statement.
I see. So we just have to keep our fingers crossed then. Professor, India has recorded more than 2 million infections, and the country currently stands at the third worst hit country in the world after the US and Brazil. What efforts are being made by authorities there to tackle the outbreak?
So I think initially there were lockdowns, I think, which many countries in the world actually prescribed to. Of course, there is this huge economic burden. I think it's a tightrope that the governments have to, run. I think many local containment efforts, particularly in Mumbai, have, given some favorable, outcomes in terms of making sure that they isolate symptomatic people and take them to isolation centers where they get medical help. So I think we need to increase our testing, and as long as medical help is available to people who show severe symptoms, and that's going to be a key, I think, in fighting this disease.
I see. All right, Professor Kotor, thank you very much for being with us live at the SAR with your thoughts.
My pleasure. Bye. Stay safe.
Korea and China marked steadily expanding ties until 2016, when Seoul accepted Washington's THAAD missile system. Now, Seoul and Beijing had been working to mend ties late last year, but the pandemic broke out, pushing bilateral interests to the sidelines. Well, in recent days, reconciliation efforts, that is, are back on track. And for more on this, I have Professor Chu Jae-woo from Kyung University. Welcome back, Professor Chu.
Thank you.
And I also have Professor Yang Jun-seok from Catholic University of Korea. Welcome, Professor.
Happy to be here.
And today I have a guest with us live from China, Dr. Li Nan from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, Dr. Li Nan.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Right, Professor Chu, we'll start with you. Following entry restrictions in March amid the pandemic, Korea was one of the first countries that China opened its doors to. How do you interpret this move, Professor Chu?
Yes, I think it's a really welcoming sign on China's part, because they definitely showed confidence in the results and the success of our quarantine efforts. And I think it also shows at the same time the confidence in our bilateral relationship. So it's a welcoming sign. But diplomatic affairs is always a two-sided coin. Because while you can be excited about the diplomatic announcements, but saying things are different from taking actions. So we cannot be too excited before actions are taken. So here, okay, diplomatic announcements is welcoming, but at the same time we cannot be too overly excited about it, because before they can before things are implemented here, then we have to wait.
Right. Mm-hmm. Professor Yang, what are your thoughts on the resumption of Seoul-Beijing economic ties at this particular moment?
Okay, well, I shudder to call it a normal situation, but if we were in a normal situation without U.S.-China conflict, it would be a very hopeful sign, because, well, Korea and China are the first two countries that possibly is heading out of the coronavirus recession. So increasing partnership between the two countries which are going out of the recession can be a very hopeful sign for the world, most of which are still struggling from the coronavirus. But there's a wild card here, which is the U.S.-China trade conflict and the so-called beginning of the Cold War between the two countries. And because of that, I think there will be a shadow on how close do Korea want to get in, to be seen with China, and what kind of balance that will maintain not only in economic relationship but in diplomatic relationship between U.S., China, and Korea. Having said that, though, right now, if you look at just the economic numbers, Korea, I think, needs China more than China needs Korea. And that's because, well, China is expected to be one of the few countries which are going to have a positive growth rate this year. Korea is doing relatively well compared to other countries, but still, Korea is expected to have a negative growth rate. And China can recover more or less on its own, because only about 20% of their economy depends on exports. About 80% of their economy is domestically driven. On the other hand, Korea, about 40% of the Korean economy is driven by exports, and a quarter of that, so about 10% of GDP, is exports to China. So if Korea wants to do better with the economic growth rate this year, more exports to China is a must.
Right. Given those circumstances, Dr. Li Nan, do you believe there is a link between Beijing's strained ties with Washington and its improving ties with Seoul?
Actually, I think right now Beijing is very cautious about the conflict and or competition between China and the United States. Right now, everybody knows right now there's a presidential election in America. And what American Trump administration doing on China is not that very normal. And we're trying to figure out how Americans for next year, how they are doing on China. So that's why China right now is very conscious on the competition between China and the United States. Also, from Chinese perspective, right now we are trying to improve relationship with South Korea, especially after coronavirus. And the Chinese public opinion on America is on Korea is very positive. That's why China is trying to use this chance to improve the relationship with South Korea beyond the SAT issue. This is the Chinese consideration.
I see. Professor Chu, as I mentioned earlier, bilateral ties had been expanding up until 2016 amid the THAAD dispute. Could you tell us a bit more about the Seoul-Beijing diplomatic endeavors since 2016?
2016, yes, there were some ups and downs, of course, and we had our ups and downs. But since 2016, if you look at it, if you recollect a little bit, then there's certainly, downside is overwhelming. And to begin with, after we made a decision to deploy THAAD in 2016, then immediately going into next year, China obviously imposed sanctions on South Korea, and we can see from the dramatic decrease and decline in Chinese tourists to South Korea, which decreased by over like 70%, from 8 million tourists to 3 million the next year, and obviously some Korean companies got mistreatment in China. and they decided to evacuate from China. And at the same time, Korean wave, Korean pop culture is not being aired in China, and so forth. So and it also has affected people-to-people exchange between the two countries. So dark side is overwhelming there, but on the economic side, I'm going to go into details later. But on the economic side, since 2016 to 2018 was very, very, very bright.
Right, and staying with the economic side, Professor Yang, tell us a bit about the bilateral economic efforts since then.
Okay, well, China still remains Korea's largest export destination as well as import source. China takes, as I mentioned before, about 25% of Korea's exports. That turns out to be about 10% of Korea's GDP. And then China is also Korea's largest import source, takes somewhere between 21 to 22% of total Korea's import comes from China. And that's almost twice as much as Korea's second largest export destination or import source, which is the United States. For China, Korea is the fourth largest export destination. It takes about 4% of Chinese exports. So as I mentioned before, in some sense, Korea is more dependent on China than China is on Korea. But Korea is the first or second largest import source, mostly for intermediate parts, high technology parts that China needs for their domestic consumption as well as exports. In 2019, Korea took about 8.4% of China's total imports, but Chinese imports from Korea has been falling very quickly. In 2019, it fell by 15.1%. And in 2020, so far during the first 5 months of the year, it fell 7.8%. And then as far as the investment is concerned, the direct investment, Korea to China and China to Korea, it has fallen quite a bit in the last few years, partially because of the THAAD retaliation, but also partially because cost in China has been rising. So in terms of direct investment, two countries are not as important as they were, say, 10 years ago.
I see. Dr. Li Nan, do you believe tensions between Seoul and Beijing are tangibly easing?
Seoul and Beijing, right?
Yes.
Actually, I think since that issue raised up, there's the bilateral relationship between China and South Korea is really getting worse. But actually, I think during this year, and both countries trying to figure out how to improve the country, I think the THAAD issue had been cooling down by both countries in our official level for a while. And the trade actually between the two countries actually has been improved. I think the only main barrier, I think, is the negative public opinion on the other in each society. And the COVID-19 provide a really good chance to improve a really positive view on Korea in China. So that's why we can say the THAAD issue has been easing up in some ways. But actually, right now, we have facing the China-US competition, and this competition is getting more intensive. So I'm afraid when the THAAD issue probably will be eased up in some way, but there's another issue, new issue, like THAAD is coming out, and that's why both leaders should well manage that. I think that is the way.
Right. Professor Chu, right before the pandemic, there had been hopes for Chinese leader Xi Jinping to visit Korea this year.
Yes.
Now, what are the chances of such a visit? And should such a visit happen, what meaning would it have on the future course of bilateral ties?
Yes, I don't know if my friend Dr. Lee would agree with me, but probably least likely this year, because I think there's some political issues that President Xi Jinping has to deal with before he reaches a decision to visit South Korea, because that issue is not totally resolved yet. So once he makes a touchdown in South Korea, that means literally that all of that issues are resolved. And if that's the case, if there's such a political implication there, then he has to deliver a strong message to his own people and constituents that, South Korea has resolved the THAAD issues that serves the interest of China. And unless he can make such safe statement with confidence to his own audience, then I don't think it'll be possible for him to reach that decision before the end of the year.
Right, so Professor Chu, your prospects on that summit is rather pessimistic right now then.
Yes, but who knows next year?
Of course, we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Yes.
Dr. Li Nan, what about you? How high are the chances of such a visit by the Chinese leader to Korea this year?
Actually, I totally agree with Professor Chow. And the first one, I think it's very much depends on the situation of coronavirus pandemic. So until now, President Xi hasn't visited any other countries since outbreak of the coronavirus. So any visit takes risk. And second, I think the Chinese government's main job right now this year is to resume the economy as soon as possible. So until this year, the main attention Chinese government has is domestic issue. And also, there's the most important thing is China-U.S. relationship is getting seriously worsened. So any visit probably add more misunderstanding between China and the United States, and maybe fueling the conflict between China and the U.S. So that's why I think it's now right time to make the visit happen this year. But actually, we can make all effort to shift the visit for next year. Next year, the U.S. election will be settling down, and the pandemic probably will be controlled well. Then we can decide when the presidency visit South Korea.
Right, hopefully the pandemic will be controlled well. Right, Professor Yang, on a slightly different note now, according to the OECD, Korea's gross domestic product will shrink by 0.8% this year. Now, this is a slight improvement from the 1.2% growth that had been, minus growth that is, that had been predicted back in June. Now, Korea itself is poised to take the smallest hit to growth among all the advanced economies. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, the happy news is that given the large negative growth that we had in the first half of the year so far, that means that at least in third or fourth quarter, Korea will have a relatively high positive growth rate. And as I mentioned before, Korea and China seems to be one of the two earliest countries to get out of the coronavirus recession. So normally, if we have some countries going out, it could shine a beacon of hope to other countries which are right now either in the midst or just getting out of coronavirus themselves. But the things that makes it complicated is that because President Trump of the United States has so much political problems with China, that Korea cannot be seen to be too close to China. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, economically, if Korea wants to have a positive growth this year, export to China is a must. So Korea has to walk in a very tight, very narrow tightrope so that we have to be friendly toward both China and the United States, and that's going to be a very difficult path to take.
Right, seeking a balance will be quite tough then. Professor Yang, findings for the second quarter showed China's economy grew by 3.2%. Under the current circumstances, what impact would cooperation between Seoul and Beijing have perhaps on the global economy, speaking broadly?
Okay, well, globally, I don't think it'll have too much effect in the short term. That's because even though China has a positive growth rate, the other countries, Europe, United States, the emerging economies, their economies are still so weak that I don't think China will have too much to export to those countries. What exports Korea should make right now is for Chinese domestic consumption rather than Chinese exports to third countries. Having said that, though, I think the symbolic effect is more important because it does show that countries are getting out of corona, their economies are returning to normal.
I see. And Dr. Li Nan, what economic course does Beijing appear to be taking in light of the pandemic? Is it focusing more on domestic then?
Yeah, definitely. Because according to CCP's report, so by 2021, China's goal is to halve the poverty in China. And China can be we call it the upper middle income country. So that's why the main job for Chinese government this year and next year is it definitely is improve the economy in the rural area. So that's why enriching the pools by assistance from the rich areas, enlarging the domestic market, and also China trying to complete industrial chain by the technology. So that's the lesson we got just from Huawei. And Taiwan recently cut chips providing cut the chip providing to Huawei. So making the Chinese realize how important to form a complete industrial chain in the high-tech area. And also Chinese government and trying to strongly support the small and middle enterprises. That's why recently President Xi just have had a formal meeting with those business owners, encourage them to take invitation in the business. Those enterprises from Chinese government perspective can partially solve with the problem of the unemployment and bring the new thinking in the business management. But all in all, I think after the coronavirus, so China's main job is to reform the system on economy. So change the rigid rules on the economy system. That is I think this is the main task Chinese government has to do and has taken a long way to go.
I see. Professor Chu, what are some of the variables that could affect Seoul-Beijing's road to reconciliation in the future?
Yes, definitely for presidential visit of China, then definitely COVID-19 is one factor, one variable factor that we could look into. And second is economic factor. Although we could be possibly making an early recovery, just like Professor Yang just pointed out, but at the same time, we have to look at one statistic that is vital to the bilateral economic relationship. From 2016 to 2018, we have incrementally increased our trade surplus from China, despite the sanctions from China. But going to 2019, then the surplus was halved from 56 billion US dollars to 24 billion US dollars. So it is really critical here, and I think we are at a critical juncture in terms of our trade relationship between the two countries. And the third is definitely, President Xi's visit to South Korea, because it entails a lot of political implications, just like we pointed out about that and that solution and so forth. Yes.
Right. Professor Yang, what are your prospects on economic relationship between Seoul and Beijing in the future?
Well, China is going to be such a big economy that Korea really cannot escape from its shadows. But Korea always has been stuck in a dilemma. The United States, for various reasons, even though in volume-wise, trade is now ranked second, it is in some sense still Korea's most important trade partner, because if you want to succeed globally, you have to succeed in the US market. So it's not just the US market volume that's important, but a European and global market as well. So Korea has always been stuck in a very strange situation between China and US. Before President Trump, China and US had not completely same goals, but at least similar targets. So there wasn't that much of a conflict. But now, especially due to President Trump, there is a large divergence of goals between US and China. They seem to be asking the various countries to tell them which side they're on. If Vice President Biden is elected, that pressure will probably lessen, but it won't disappear completely. So Korea will still have to walk a very narrow tightrope. It might be the range might be more wider under President Biden, but still, Korea will have to walk that tightrope between China and U.S. because both markets are just so important.
Right. All right, Professor Yang, thank you very much for your insight. And Professor Chu, thank you always for being with us today. And Dr. Li Nan over in China, thank you for joining us live at this hour.
And my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, it's time to say goodbye then. Do join us again tomorrow at this hour for more on the latest about the pandemic here and elsewhere around the world. In the meantime, do take care and do abide by safety measures. Thank you for being with us today.